everybody. I am Betsy Fisher-Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at AU, and welcome to our Women on Wednesdays series. This is our final program of the semester, so we're glad that you all could join us. For those of you who may be new to some of our events, want to let you know that WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in our School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we do that through research, conversations like this one, academic and practical campaign training that help women build the skills, confidence, and the networks to lead. And tonight's conversation really goes to the heart of our work, and that is understanding women's political leadership. Who gets seen, who gets supported, and really what it takes to build a more representative democracy. And we are especially pleased to be joined by Atima Omara. She is a frequent WPI guest speaker and contributor to our Gender on the Ballot blog. And she has a brand new book out. In fact, it just published yesterday. So hot off the press. The title of the book is The Instigators: How Black Women Have Been Essential to American Democracy, parentheses, and what we can learn from them. Atima is a political strategist, organizer, advocate, commentator, and her work has focused on campaigns, democracy, race, gender, and political power. And her book looks at Black women as organizers and candidates, voters, journalists, strategists, and movement builders, and really shows how their leadership has shaped American democracy again and again. So Atima, thank you so much for being here with the brand new book, and congratulations.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and just be in conversation.
Yeah. And want to let everybody know too that we are going to save plenty of time for your questions. So if you want to go ahead and as we're talking, put those into the Q&A in the Q&A tab. We will be sure to save some time and get to some of those as well. But Atima, let me just start kind of with the title, because you kind of reclaim this word instigator, which can often be used as a criticism. What does that word mean to you, and why did you want to use it for this discussion of Black women's political leadership?
Yeah, when I was thinking about, sort of the thesis that I had that, you look at a lot of
Hmm.
social movements in this country for change, and that a lot of women, a lot of Black women are at the vanguard, the forefront. And I was trying to think of a word that really encapsulated that. And I was going through like the synonyms, as it were, and I came across instigator as a noun, and oftentimes it's used in negative context. It's usually as an antagonizer, antagonist person, weaponized against women, certainly in their political activism and leadership. But it also very fundamentally, like, if you look at the dictionary, it means somebody who initiates or starts something for change.
Hmm.
That is really the through line for all of the stories of the women, both in the past and the present, that I tell.
I wanted to, you start off the book with a quote from Trevor Noah. And I wanted to, it's a great quote, and I want to play, let me just share my screen here. I want to play a little portion of that for everybody and get you to talk about it, because I think it kind of frames really nicely the book. If I can share my screen here. Hold on, maybe not, maybe not, maybe not.Hold on. PowerPoint.
If you truly want to,
I don't think you can see that. Hold on. Technical difficulties all around today.
learn about America.
You probably can't see that. Hold on. Let's see. I can do this now.
I feel
Bye, everybody. Sorry about that.
yeah, I think if you, I recall from when you share, and then you have to pick the screen where the video.
Yeah, I got it. It just wasn't coming up right here.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Here it is. I think everybody's going to see this.
You truly want to learn about America. Talk to Black women. Yeah. Because unlike everybody else, Black women cannot afford to fuck around and find out. Black people understand how hard it is when things go bad, especially in America, but any place where Black people exist, whether it's Brazil, whether it's South Africa, wherever it is, when things go bad, Black people know that it gets worse for them. But Black women in particular, they know what shit is, genuinely. People always be shocked. They'll be like, why do Black women turn out the way they do in America? Why do they vote the way? Yeah, because they know what happens if things do not go the way it should. They cannot afford to f around and find out.
Why did you want to frame that at the beginning of the book?
Yeah, I really wanted to set a tone
Yeah.
for, um, you know, why I added the and what we can learn from them. We're
Mm-hmm.
at this point where we're discussing the erosion of democratic norms and institutions and how should we respond in that moment. And oh, America hasn't been, here before. And, there's a lot of people they have not sort of experienced this. But it is very familiar to a lot of people of color in this country, especially Black people. There are the stories of Jim Crow, but also living in communities where the government isn't working for you in the way it should. Even today, like I think of Flint, Michigan, where like
Right.
just trying to get water clean, right? Or you see in Louisiana recently where they removed somebody or attempted to get rid of some office that somebody had, rightfully won, a Black man who had been wrongfully incarcerated. So, you think about those experiences and that arms you with a strategic kind of insight and a know-how about navigating when the system is not working for you and how to push for something better. And I thought, I want to set the tone for when people start to read this, of, okay, knowing that, what can we learn from them in reading this book? Yeah.
And the book deals with politics and history, but it's also personal and as well. And how much of it has come from your own experience? And talk a little bit about your upbringing in Virginia, the daughter of Ugandan immigrants, and how that shaped you and what spurred your interest in politics in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a lot of friends whose parents are refugees or they're refugees themselves. And, they, had parents who were like over it. They had been active in the politics of their country and they had PTSD
Mm,
from that and, just weren't raised to really think about that. That was like something that other people did. Um, while my dad wasn't like active in politics, he very much paid attention to the politics of this country, and I gotta talk about how he really impressed upon me the importance of a free press,
right.
um, and how it functions in a democracy to hold people accountable. And then, I had a mom who was very thoughtful in her parenting of me and raising my political awareness and, making sure I sort of understood this country that they had come to live in, where I was being raised, and its history, and reading books and watching Roots, and just really having like thoughtful conversations about race and gender and how it all sort of intersects. And so those kind of planted seeds, but I always didn't think I was going to be in politics because when I, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, you looked at a lot of TV, and it was rare to see a lot of Black
Right.
people, a lot of very few white women in power at that point. Um, so it didn't resonate with me, but at a point at the end of college through my own student government experience, and enjoying the experience of being involved in initiatives for students that improved the overall university student body's life. I was like, huh, I wonder what this would be like if it was to be done in the real world. And,
Mm.
I had thought my impact would be in medicine or law, like a good kid at immigrants. And, when I realized I wanted to do it in a more tangible way, like policy, that was that was affecting a broader population of people. That's when I got it kind of clicked for me, like, oh, these things I care about, and maybe there's a space for me in this work. And so that's what led me to this career.
And you've helped other people run for office, and then you've actually made a run for office yourself. Kamala Harris ran her race in 107 days, and you ran yours in 7 days.
Mhm.
It was a
Yeah.
special election. Tell us about sort of that experience, how you became a candidate, and then what you understood. How did that change what you understood about the barriers that Black women face when they step forward to lead?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I had worked for a lot of women in politics organizations. I
Mhm.
volunteered for Emily's List. I'd worked for lots of candidates that were women primarily, and just thinking of some of the PACs and stuff I volunteered for, raise money, help with trainings at that point, and thought I knew everything, like just what to expect. And it's very different when you are, the candidate. And I think what happened was that I had an understanding of what women experience, and I was certainly experiencing that, but it was even different from my white women counterparts who were running. One was white presenting, although she was Iranian, but she was white presenting. And the other one was a white woman. And there were just things that were just slightly different. And I
Mm.
couldn't put my finger on it at the time. And it wasn't really until I came across research from the Barbara Lee Foundation, that of course does, had until recently done a lot of research on women in politics and exploring attitudes, that I realized it was a certain form of how Black women are treated when they're running for public office. So, no matter their accomplishments, they're always kind of questioned, they're always kind of undermined. If all of a sudden you do a lot of great work, and then when it's time for you to step up to run for public office, people question that, but also, then try to, poo-poo your accomplishments by saying, you're not that motivated, you're kind of disorganized, like a lot of these code words
Mm.
that are very sort of, to use the term misogynoirist, where it's just like this very specific thing. It's like attacking like Black women and their ability to lead and whatnot, in a very focused way. And so I didn't realize that until later, though, as there was more research coming out about the
Yeah.
experience of Black women running for office, that's what I was experiencing.
And I mentioned Kamala Harris, and you also talk about that in the book, and
Yeah.
you argue that she was unfairly blamed in many ways after 2024.
Mhm.
What has been missing from this kind of post-election conversation that's been going on, the postmortems of what happened and why, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of conversation, and I think I saw your post about it and talking about this this panel, but it was there's conversation around the strategy. And, there was blaming her for a strategy like that she didn't even enact, that, was not one that she even kind of supported, which was, oh, because she kind of really played into her race and her gender. And, it was the opposite. She was trying very much not to talk about it,
Hmm.
as a candidate to, oh, well, she was not a candidate that had sort of the capability to run this type of race. She was not a great candidate, which I thought was interesting, right? Like that somebody would say that. I'm like, this is a woman who's won every race that she you know has been in, minus her run for president in 2020. That's it. That's the only race before 2024 that she hadn't won.
Right.
And and then meanwhile, like Joe Biden ran two presidential races that he lost. Rarely did anybody ever really bring that up. And he almost didn't win the third, which got, where he got the nomination, in the primary. And so I was like, oh, this is so interesting, like how these double standards are coming up. There's all this conversation about what she didn't do right. And I'm like, she was in an unusual circumstance of it's 107 days. that's a snap election in Europe, which their structure and their systems are prepared for something like that. In our country, we expect a lot more time. So she was already doing something new. She was trying
Mm-hmm.
to bridge a gap that the man she had served under as vice president had left, like literally like a voter gap. She had closed that gap. She had raised more money than any other candidate had historically in a run for president. She had, I mean, all sorts of praise, even reluctantly from, conservatives about her debate performance. And yet, people were like, oh, she was terrible. I was like, oh, this is convenient. Instead of turning, the mirror around and looking at what maybe um, you all didn't do as sort of the party apparatus, media coverage that helped contribute to this. And in the ways that you undermined and made it difficult. There are certainly reasons that people didn't vote for her. But I also found that the dialogue around who was to like specifically blame and all was all on her and not on really rethinking strategies and tactics and the message
Mm-hmm.
that had led to a point where she had to run a race that she wasn't expecting to run going into
Right.
2024. Yeah.
When you think back on this and have current conversations, what happened in that race and like you said, sort of this, unwillingness to sort of acknowledge other structural issues that were going on, right? Um, what do you think the impact of that race will have on future Black women candidates for higher office?
Yeah, well, we're already sort of seeing that with Jasmine Crockett when
Mm-hmm.
she decided she wanted to run for the US Senate. Like initially she wanted to, be in leadership with House oversight. She was told to wait her turn. An older a white man, Jerry Conley, who was alive at the time, was being pushed by leadership. So she was like, okay, well, where else can I go and, do some service, use my energy and skill set to some good. And she threw her name in the ring for U.S. Senate. And a lot of people question that
Right.
and her audacity and why did she think she could win? And I found that interesting, but nobody was saying, oh, James Tallarico, who actually was not even had not even served in Congress, was a state house member, a well-liked state house member, but he didn't have a statewide profile in the slightest. It was just sort of that was the first thing where I was like, okay, the same thing that sort of happened to
Mm,
Kamala Harris, my own experience. And then, just the last few days, I saw on social media, a white musician in Hollywood of some kind. He mentioned, when Kamala Harris decided to endorse Karen Bass in the race for mayor, instead of saying, oh, you know, here's somebody with this policy that I disagree with, is endorsing somebody who I don't, like for these reasons, he says, oh, look at basically a loser endorsing another loser.
mm.
And a lot of Black women jumped on that and were like, well, that is racist, that is sexist. You're talking about Karen Bass, who is literally the first Black woman speaker in United States history in a state legislative body, who was like duly elected to Congress, who was chair of the Congressional Black Caucus before she retired and ran for mayor. Then we've got Kamala Harris, who again, local DA, then Attorney General, twice elected, then U.S. Senator. I'm not seeing losers here. I'm seeing really accomplished, had to, show up and dance backward in high heels in their political careers type of women. So, yeah, it was interesting that that was lobbied, but somebody like a Pete Buttigieg or I think one of the guys who's running Spencer Pratt, who's like a former reality TV star from the early aughts, they don't have, a lot of public service credibility.
Right.
Yeah, they're more viable. It's kind of interesting.
So, how do you try to encourage young Black women to be more involved in the political process to run for office themselves in light of all of this that you rightly point out a stack
Yeah.
against? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I really come into it, wanting to be very honest. I say these are the things you're going to expect. Some of it you're going to recognize it from your experiences, maybe in the workplace or navigating other attempts to hold leadership positions and the politics that kind of come with that. And, preparing them in the reality of what they'll face while running for office. And, you know, whether that's dressing or how you look or how you say certain things, if a candidate is getting attacked, for something that they were perceived to have done. And even if you think it's racist and sexist, like, making sure that you have a cadre of folks lined up to speak up for you. Because that in research, definitely allows the candidate to focus on the race, but also having people around them who can like really kind of sling that mud, as it were, in
Mhm.
defense of the candidate. So I try to advise them with, knowing what the system is in mind and how it's going to be. And that's not always the case for a lot of Black women candidates. Like
Right.
I've worked on campaigns where I've come in and the campaign does a good job of anticipating and dealing with some of these things. And I've worked on others where I've had to say respectfully, she can't say those things the same way that even a white woman candidate could say it. And so, playing that role and trying to be thoughtful and using my experience as a former candidate for office too.
That's great. And I'll take this opportunity to plug anybody who may be watching or who knows a young woman who may be interested in running for office that we have a campaign training program at WPI called We Lead. And we do use a lot of the research that Atima just talked about from the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, et cetera, and do our campaign training for young women who want to run for office. It's a free program that we have fully funded, and we're currently accepting applications for our fall cohort. So we'll put some info in the chat if there's anyone who would like some more information on that. I would encourage anyone to apply or let a friend know as well, because it's so important, like you said, Tima, just to understand the research that's out there, understand how to operate in, a climate that we certainly don't like, but that certainly exists, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you also about Black women voters because you spend a lot of time in the book on this topic and
Yeah.
often described as the backbone of the Democratic Party, right?
Mhm.
But, and what's the but there?
Yeah. The but being that oftentimes when it comes to one actually sort of engaging with these voters in a substantive way, like that's not just 2 weeks before election day, and or saying, hey, you've done all of the service and work, lend your talents as a leader in the party. Those two things don't go together usually. So there's a love of the labor of Black women and women in general, and not so much of a eager sense of like we're gonna then capitalize on this talent and elevate them and give them opportunity.
Right. And we hear so much about swing voters too. And you in the book challenge kind of this fixation that we have on, what is essentially white swing voters, right?
Mhm.
And what should campaigns understand about people who swing between voting and not voting? What are your thoughts on that and why maybe that fixation shouldn't be there?
Yeah, I think there are most voters who have political leanings and ideas of where they're going to be.
Yeah.
Even if they're like, I don't affiliate or register with either of the parties. I think there's that. But I think more fundamentally, like, and I think the Republican Party is very good at this. They are like, we're going to go after our base, make sure it's solid, keep them happy. And then we go after everybody else.
Hmm.
Um, Democratic Party doesn't spend a lot of time doing that. They don't, I was trained on campaigns like you focus on the people who vote all the time. A lot of those folks tend to be people who kind of go back and forth, tend to be older, not sort of representative of the majority of the electorate. So you miss a huge bunch of people, not the least of which are a lot of younger folk, black and brown people, folks who might have moved a few times because they're not living in a home full time, they don't have a mortgage, and so, not solidifying the base, like the foundation of your house, as I call it. You can't then go after people when you don't have your home teams with you, right? We don't
Right.
teach that in like political fundraising. Like you call your day ones, the people who've been with you and who know you to give you money first, and then you move out. We don't seem to apply that to voter engagement.
You also, we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but just kind of the role of the media
Hmm.
and the media today. And you argue that, you know, Black media needing more investment and talk a little bit about what you think is missing sort of in this current media ecosystem that's out there. And I'd also be curious, what is kind of your media diet? What are some publications that you are particularly drawn to that are doing reporting and covering communities that need to be covered?
Yeah, I think, the one big thing, in thinking about media that is really reflective of democracy and what's going on. It's easy
Yeah.
if you're just reading one type of newspaper that has a certain type of perspective and covers a certain segment of the population. For a chunk of, I would say the later half of the 20th century and into the early 20th century, that was definitely a lot of main, stream media.
Yeah.
So, in some of the studies I pull for the book, they found that like when people would watch television, they would see a lot. When they would see black people or they would see brown people, they were usually because of it was specifically crime. It wasn't anything related to, just like a nice life story or some other news segment or something interesting going on in the community. And that, makes an impact on somebody if that's
Sure.
all you're seeing when you're watching the news. And so, Black media sort of sprung out of this because they're like, well, somebody has to chronicle what's happening in our community and its concerns. And also use our media to kind of spotlight, corruption and abuses, because there was a point in this country where you couldn't depend on local media per se to report the correct story, especially during Jim Crow. And so that's how Black media sort of evolved. I think women's media evolved in a similar way. As there was just like a sort of way that women were portrayed, if they were portrayed at all, their concerns, their stories, their lives, health crises, political opinions. And that's how you have, outlets like Ms. Magazine,
Right.
come to fruition. And so, in this time frame, unfortunately, because, long story short, like we don't have a fairness doctrine. Our media is more splintered. Um, you've got a lot of consolidation of a lot of outlets. Local news is closing. We're kind of at a downturn with journalism right now. And that means that but we're in a time frame where we really actually need good media that is reporting on what is happening. Some of those get deep into investigative stories. So the more money there is in media, the more likely you're able to actually have really good, deep, and thoughtful investigative reporting stories that take time and resources and sometimes travel for these reporters to do. And so for me, I really started, one, looking at some freelance reporters that I, like and admire. Georgia Fort's a good example of, somebody who she recently actually got arrested for some of her coverage in Minnesota. Just, reporting on what was happening on the ground. And she's a good example of the type of journalist who's like, all right, I'm just going to go out and report the story and, feed it to outlets and, depends on the donations of people. And that's something that Ida B. Wells and a lot of other, Black women journalists historically in this country have done. There's like nonprofit newsrooms that are being stood up more and more, which is great because they're not, subject to shareholders. So you've got the 19th, of
Right.
course, you've got Capital B, you got ProPublica, who are good examples of this, who have the resources and the funding. So, part of what I encourage in the book is like, one, if you see freelance reporters that you really love their stuff and you want to see them to continue to do the work they're doing, donate whatever little bit you can. And also, the same with these nonprofit newsrooms. But and the concern I think also is that as there's consolidation, a lot of staff get let go, and the ones who get let go are usually, usually women, a lot of people of
Mm-hmm.
color.
Mm-hmm.
Teen Vogue's political department was completely wiped out. And they were made up of a very diverse staff of young people, people of color, queer folk, trans folks who were writing on stories of things that were happening to young people around the country, that they should know about, as young people, the reader should know about. So that's an idea, just to give you an idea of like, one, some of the outlets I'm looking at, but also to the importance of media to the democratic experiment.
For sure. And, like you said, too, like local newspapers, too, are struggling and they're the ones covering a lot of communities, right?
Hmm.
And they're kind of shells of themselves in a lot of places. There are exceptions, of course, but that certainly is the trend. I loved in the book your focus on some of the instigators of the past, and the spotlight that you put on some of maybe the lesser known Black women in history, or women that we should all know about. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time in the interest of really letting people know some of these stories of what these remarkable women did. And one of them I just wanted to highlight first is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, because she's one of the most important figures in your book. And many people, they might not know her story. So, who was she, and why does she feel so relevant to this conversation today that you have in the book?
Yeah, I when I came across her, I was like, oh, I gotta write something about her because here she was, and a lot of people think of suffrage and especially the women's suffrage movement. They think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they think of
Right.
Susan B. Anthony. Sometimes if they think of Black women, they think of Ida B. Wells. In addition to being a journalist, she was that too. But Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was unique in that she wasn't born into slavery. She was born into a free family. She got a sense of what was happening in the South in regards to slavery through her own, like, actual being a teacher. She was an accomplished poet, an accomplished writer, a great speaker, and from having, been a teacher and having to do that all the time. And she, was hearing what was happening in the South on plantations and was like, I want to be part of the abolition movement. And so that's how she became known. She started traveling around the country, getting requested as a popular orator, and her pieces were getting published. She was on the same stage as Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So I say all this because, post the Civil War and the emancipation of a lot of enslaved Black people, there's a discussion about what do we do next in this Reconstruction era at this point. And it was a push for, like, the women's vote. And she went to this women's conference and she's like, listen, like, my experience as a Black woman, even as a free Black woman, is night and day from your experience as white women. I don't have access to the same things. We're, in danger a lot. And so we got to kind of like come together here, basically giving a very important speech that I quote, that we're all bundled up into this, like,
Mhm.
piece of humanity. We have to work together. Nobody's getting free until we're all free. Right. And really encourages her white colleagues and Frederick Douglass and some of the Black men to, start this American Equal Rights Association, which was a universal suffrage organization in the 1860s. And to think about that and what could have happened had the universal suffrage effort actually gone forward, because what ended up happening was politicians playing politicians games. Folks were like, well, we'll get black men the vote first. And then Katie Stanton and Anthony balked at that. And we're like, we're out of here. And Francis is like, wait, I thought we were all in this together. And then,
Yeah.
and then Douglas was like, 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 yeah, black men we can like vote on behalf of black women. And she's like, that's not how this is supposed to work. Yeah. So, I thought she was a good example of like how we've had moments in history where they're like inflection points where we can go one
Yes.
direction, and she's like the moral center, like like no, we can do universal suffrage, everyone. Let's go for the multiracial democracy for everyone here. Like, and she's just an example of that, that I find in different other folks throughout history.
What are some of the other lesser known instigators that you wish more people knew about?
Yeah, a lot of people love to talk about, Emma Goldman and Mother Jones as women labor activists.
Hmm.
I came across her. She was nicknamed the Goddess of Anarchy. And a young black woman, Lucy Parsons, who was a labor organizer and orator. So if you're heavily involved in labor organizing, you've probably come across her name in history, but not as much. But she was a contemporary of Mother Jones and Emma Goldman, and was really, much more forceful on the issue of the rights of workers, and then getting paid a fair wage. She what became a well-known speaker throughout the country and a writer. And she had been enslaved at one point in her life. Um, what was fascinating about her was that, she helped start a garment workers union. She was a very talented seamstress, and started a garment worker union, which was mostly women. And, she was out organizing when she was very visibly pregnant. I think, yeah, she was very visibly pregnant. And then after she gave birth to her first child, she came back out like weeks later, not even 8 weeks later. Didn't wait the full 8 weeks, just like came right back into organizing. And the reason I say that, like, she was very visibly pregnant, is like the late 19th century. Like,
Yeah.
women, the
Yeah.
moment you have a little bump, they're like,
Yeah.
go inside.
Yeah.
So she was always pushing the envelope on what was expected of her as a woman,
Hmm.
an organizer. She was always educating herself and reading and thinking of ways of advancing the right of the people, and getting and advocating for people's rights as workers. Yeah, so she's one that I just find super fascinating,
Yeah.
and the partnership she had with her husband as well. Mhm.
You you write on our Gender on the Ballot blog that I think we have in the chat. If not, we will. About this very topic about Black women, leading these fights over labor, environmental justice, disability rights, voting rights, all of this. Eh, Like, are we too narrow in how we think about political leadership? Because so much of the work that Black women has done, has happened outside of kind of elected office, right?
Yeah, so much of it has. And that was sort of the point that I wanted to highlight with the book,
Yeah,
was that yes, you can be um, a woman who decides, I want to make an impact by serving in public office. But that's not the
sure.
only way you can make an
Right.
impact. You can be a journalist, you can be an organizer, you can be a fundraiser, you could be somebody who leads a nonprofit. There's just so many different ways and paths for you to make impact. And it's something, especially now, as people are like, well, I don't want to run for office and I don't want to work in a campaign. But there's still plenty of ways for you to make impact, because honestly, we need both. Like, there's a lot of tension, and I talk about this in the book, between elected officials and then activists. And they're like sniping at each other. And elected officials are like, leave me alone. Like, I know what's best. And activists are like, we would leave you alone if you actually did like the right thing sometimes. We know you have competing interests. And they go back and forth with each other. And you actually need all of it in a democracy to sort of thrive. That's the whole point of a democracy. Otherwise, it's not a democracy. So, you know.
I want to take some questions too. So if anybody, don't be shy out there. If anybody has a question, feel free to type it in. I'll also let you know in the chat, we have a link to the book, which Atima just gave us a discount code link. So if anybody's interested in purchasing the book, you can do so at a discount. There's a link in the chat for that. So let me see if we have any questions. And again, don't be shy, everybody. If you have a question, please let us know. The first one here is Atima, about you, if you're planning on running for a political office again, now that you're an author.
Yeah, well, never say never. Never say never. I have thought about it, but at this point, I'm more so thinking about, the next book or the next stories that I can tell as a contribution to the work. But the right opportunity comes along, I'll definitely consider it.
Tell us more about the other things that you're doing now, the kind of campaigns that you're working on, or candidates that you're advising, and sort of what drives you to do that.
Yeah, initially after 2016 election, I knew I had a lot of friends who were all trying to figure out what they wanted to do in light of, the election not going the way a lot of them had thought. And some ran for office, some started, organizations, started becoming active fundraisers. I had done a lot of that by that point. And so I ended up, starting my own consulting firm with the My Strategy Group, where I get to work with women candidates, help with training, coaching, debate
Mhm.
prep. I worked with Andrea Campbell when she was a mayoral candidate for Boston. Still keep in touch with her now. She's Attorney General of Massachusetts. I've worked with Lieutenant Governor in Rhode Island, Zabita Matos. I've worked with Higher Heights for America and candidate training and political program for their endorsed candidates, Black women candidates. I've worked with labor unions like SEIU, and just in turning out voters when I work with organizations. Often I'm working on helping them, engage voters that otherwise aren't engaged in the political process. And those are things like I love doing because, I have on my business website, very much believer in a reflective democracy and
Mhm.
working with organizations that are really committed to that.
You mentioned a couple names, but are there other Black women candidates out there that we should be watching, sort of like the rising stars?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, totally. Well, Juliana Stratton in Illinois, I think, she's the way Illinois sort of politics works. It's expected that she'll be the new senator from Illinois. And so definitely from everything I've heard from my Illinois friends, rising star and just great. Keeping an eye on Georgia and what happens with this primary and Keisha Lance Bottoms emerging as the nominee. Maybe Georgia has another shot of a Black woman governor. Um, so those are some of the key people that just sort of like come to mind, at least on the federal and the state
mhm.
level. Um, yeah, that are running for office.
And here's a question about you. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but is there specific advice you would give to Black women who are interested in becoming active within the political sphere, whether that's running for office or, volunteering for Democratic campaigns, or I'll just add on getting involved in more of an activism role that we talked about?
Yeah, I think especially when you're still trying to figure it out, try different things. Like I volunteered on campaigns and then I realized I loved it and I wanted to do more of it and found through volunteering it's easy to get hired that
Yeah.
way because you're working a lot of hours. If you're willing to do all of them, they're like, hey, you want
Right.
to do more? Love those folks. I hired a lot of people that way.
Mm.
If you want to run for office, go through a candidate training, hear from other elected officials, volunteer, work in an office of an elected official, get a sense of what it's like, to be an elected official. You want to be active in community related stuff. You want to see what that's like, find your local volunteer organizations that, are doing work in your community. What are the issues that you care about? Really narrow that down. Um, and think about how you want to, spend your time doing work. A lot of people are surprised to learn they're like, wait, you had time to volunteer, but when I was active on campaigns, I tried to like do a shift or two at a domestic violence shelter, once a month for quite a
Hmm.
few years, just because, I really care about, the issue of intimate partner violence. And it was just a way where I could not be really in charge of anything. I could just focus on, serving and helping these people transition to a new life.
And that you can also, in those kind of environments, when you're in a role to think about policies that help some of this by
Thank
being
you.
on the ground and seeing firsthand, right? That's
Yep.
a big advantage as well, right?
Yeah, 1000. Some of the best elected officials that we've had, and I'll say this from either party, are those who are very closest to a
Right.
lot of the issues, that are of concern to people. Like, I think there's a reason that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez can speak kind of rather eloquently to the experience of being working class and trying to figure out paying off student loan debt while working like, a job as a bartender and in a restaurant. Or Ayanna Presley, being sort of active in politics and in her experience, living in a housing complex when she was younger and advocating for affordable housing. There's lots of these like stories. Cori Bush, when I think about her, just one telling her own
Hmm.
story about her reproductive health access fight for her own personal self and experience going through abortion, but then also having been homeless and really speaking to that in a way that other members of Congress had never experienced. She's like, you don't know what it's like to sleep in your car. I do. And it's, and that was critical in her protest, and her work around that was critical in the fight for during the pandemic when folks needed their the rent moratorium extended so they could stay in their homes while folks were inside and weren't able to go to their jobs that were needed.
Right.
Mhm.
Here's a question. I know you're a Virginia person, but we have somebody asking about, can you talk a bit about how to access elected office in DC since it doesn't have a state government, et cetera? What do you know about
Yeah,
DC politics?
yeah. I don't know if it means, I don't know if in the question it's sort of like access or run, but I know that the predominant party, there's a Republican Party. I don't know how active it is, but there's a very active DC Democratic Party. They do have electoral board and ways to get involved in elections and your local political party activism. There's also like a lot of community organizations as well, that I would encourage folks to take a look at.
That's great. Let's see if we have some other questions here. Um, what would it actually look like for a political party to genuinely invest in Black women voters and not just rely on them? We talked about the fact that it doesn't happen, but what would it look like if it did happen?
Yes, well, one, I also get my book because I go into great detail about some of
Yeah.
this. But I will say top lines is, actually, I will say in the 2024 election, a lot of folks that I worked with, or who were doing movement work or turnout work, we're not getting the same money that they got in 2020 to turn out voters. And if they were getting it. I remember there was somebody, and she was not even leading, she is a Black woman, but she was not leading an organization that was predominantly Black led. But it was critical to a lot of voter engagement. And she's like, I was getting all this money in October. What the heck can I do? I mean, I'll find a way to spend it. But like, imagine if I got in that money in July or June, the voter engagement I could have done in communities that are harder to reach and engage. So that, for one, is taking seriously voter engagement in Black women and the Black community and communities of color as voters. Um, and not only just the organizing investment, but the financial investment. And also, giving them opportunities to rise up on campaigns because you have it's still for as diverse as it's gotten in the last few years, even since I was working on campaigns. A lot of folks in leadership are not sort of reflective of the base of the Democratic Party. So,
Mhm.
you you want to have that. And one way is to show that you're taking them seriously is like elevating, Black women, and just, you know, folks in different communities, elevating them more to leadership roles on campaigns or in organizations.
What about the role of campuses? I know in the book you talked about HBCU students as part of the story, but what role do campuses play in developing sort of the future instigators out there?
Quite a bit. You know, what was like sort of interesting is because there was like not a lot of places. I think there was like Oberlin, a couple of the universities that accepted Black people around the US. And so HBCUs became really a hub of Black
Right.
leadership and organizing, and just education for sort of the folks who are very talented. Still quite the case, but now more spread out since desegregation of universities and colleges. But they're very critical. They still are. And, out of Black students who went to predominantly white universities, out came, the Divine Nine, the AKAs, the Deltas, the Alphas, and other fraternities and sororities that were also provided unique communities to develop civic engagement and leadership as well.
So here's a great question to end on. We'll end on a high note here. Given everything that you've documented in the book, what gives you hope about the future of American democracy?
Yeah, what gives me hope, is always, and this is why, when I talk about instigators, I say there's definitely this demographic of folks who are 18 to 45, and it's not respective to a particular generation. It's just over time, over every period of time, you can find a group of these younger Black women who are kind of leading the charge. And I see that today. And they're looking around and they're like, status quo is no longer working. But I'm also seeing a lot of people who are also saying, I agree. What can I do about it? And that gives me hope, in a way that I think, I wouldn't be in this work if I didn't have always a little bit of hope. But I think it does give me hope that a lot more people are like, hey, how can I do something? How can I be useful? And I
Right.
wanted to offer, this book as sort of an offering toward, what are possibilities of those things you can do, because yes, I say Black women have been essential to democracy and shaping it and building it, and for it to be more multiracial and true, to that belief, to that idea, rather. But they can't do it alone. We all of our arms got to be linked together in building this, getting more women elected to public office, getting more, Black and Latino and Asian and Indigenous people elected to office. That will take all of us. So, the fact that there are more people who are interested in how we can make our American democracy actually work for people, is great, and that gives me hope.
Well, thank you, Atima, for putting this book out and sharing your perspective with us. And we look forward to having you back at WPI soon. And we always appreciate your insights and participation in our Gender on the Ballot blog and everything. So thank you for sharing with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for watching. And I hope everyone has a great summer. We will see you in the fall. Thank
Thank
you.